The very mention of it is enough to send a shiver up the spine. What could be more gruesome than people eating each other? But the truth is, cannibalism was a fact of life in pre-Pākehā New Zealand. Not that you'd necessarily know much about this aspect of our history, because, as Rod Vaughan reports, many Kiwis consider the whole subject a bit too close to the bone.
Scattered across New Zealand are the remains of untold Maori. Maori who, in many cases, died in horrific circumstances and were then subject to the ultimate degradation.
If we're looking at the situation at the end of a battle, you've gone to someone else's territory, you've defeated them, there's a chance that another war party might assemble and try to seek retribution. So you have to be fairly quick about the cannibalism, and what happens there is typically arms or legs are taken off, they're thrown onto embers or just held over a fire, cooked very quickly, eaten, and then the war party leaves.
Cannibalised remains do feature in the archaeological record of New Zealand. Chilling reminders of perhaps the greatest taboo in our history. What Captain Cook called a horrid practice.
When there's no threat from outside, what tended to happen was that someone would be killed, the flesh would be peeled off, scraped off with a shell, and it would be wrapped in leaves and put in a hangi and cooked that way.
Historian Paul Moon has just written the first book on this macabre topic. This horrid practice lifts the lid on cannibalism in this country, a subject that's received scant attention from chroniclers of New Zealand history.
It's a major part of our history that's been largely ignored, and some of the general histories written about New Zealand now in fact don't even mention cannibalism at all.
Which is a curious omission, given that few Maori would deny it occurred.
For any Māori to deny that is to make a lie of their own histories.
The Reverend Hone Ka has read Moon's book and backs up some of the propositions.
We're talking about a ferocious, warlike people, and it was practiced purely and simply because when you live in a constant state of war, what do you do with all that spare meat that's lying around? I mean, let's face some realities. They took very little with them when they went to battle, expecting to be able to pick up some booty somewhere, and human flesh was part of that.
What were some of the other reasons for cannibalism?
Well, I had an old uncle who died at the age of 92 who told me that his grandfather told him that there were times when there was a shortage of food, and they took young people along for a walk and took them up cliffs and pushed them over. And when they died, they took those home and ate them.
So humans were seen as a valuable source of food?
Well, very much so. Good protein, obviously. My mother told us horrendous stories told her by her grandmother that her parents used to smack their chops when they saw little children walking past, especially ones that were well nourished.
But cannibalism, Moon says, was not about simply extending the menu. More often, it occurred in the aftermath of battle. The vanquished devoured by the victors.
It was partly for insult, partly for a sense of conquest. The insult element appears in some of the oral histories. The fact that your enemy is being turned into excrement eventually means that you really have insulted them to the utmost limit. But in other cases, if you conquered someone's territory, eating the people who formerly lived there was a symbol of your conquest, that you'd conquered them so thoroughly that you could even consume the people who once occupied the land.
The picture Moon paints of pre-European Maori society is not a pretty one.
The terror and the fear involved in fighting was substantial. One of the arguments being proposed by a social psychologist, Eli Sargan, who's looked at traditional cannibalism, and he says that the terror involved in cannibalism creates borderline personality disorders. He said there's a disrupted personality function as a result of witnessing cannibalism and participating in it. And he describes it almost as a cycle of abuse, that every generation gets involved in it and they practice cannibalism and it gets carried on to the next generation.
Perhaps understandably, this characterisation of terror and paranoia has not won Moon many friends in the Maori community. The book has ruffled more than a few feathers. In fact, he was advised from the outset that writing it was not a good idea.
The first comment I got was actually from a colleague, and he said, this will destroy your career if you write about this topic.
Moon has waged a battle in print with Maori academics over some of the conclusions and the quality of scholarship in the book. Hone Ka has doubts about it as well.
The question that I raise in my mind is, why does Paul Moon find it necessary to write that book now? What does it do to the white majority of New Zealand to have this book arrive right at this point in our history?
So do you suspect his motives for writing this? What do you think his motives were in writing this?
Oh, he's a sensationalist. He wants to make a name for himself. And I believe that Moon is, I don't think he's a good historian.
I'm sure there are people out there now who aren't happy with the book, and some of them have made themselves known, others probably mumbling about it privately to themselves. But they have the choice not to read it.
You seem to be saying that there's some sort of political agenda behind his decision to write this book at this particular time.
I suppose I am. And I'm not sure what his politics are, but I get the impression that he's quite dismissive of a lot of things Māori, that Māori themselves are saying.